Our final story of Deathly Delights is a heart-stopping tale of unspeakable terror. If you ever had a terrible secret, or if you ever committed an act that your conscience told you not to, you had better sit back, close your eyes, and listen very carefully to this, the Telltale Heart.
True, I had been, and still am, extremely, terribly nervous. But why would you say that I am crazy? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all, my sense of hearing was improved. I heard all things in heaven and earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I a maniac? Listen and hear how reasonably, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain. But once the thought was there, it haunted me day and night. There was no reason. I loved the old man. He'd never done me any harm. He had never insulted me. I had no desire for his money. I think it was his eye. Yes, that's what it was. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it looked at me, my blood turned cold, and so, very slowly, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and to get rid of the evil eye. Now this is the point. You think I am mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how smart I was, with what caution, with what planning I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the entire week before I killed him. And every night, around midnight, I turned the lock of his bedroom door and opened it very gently. And then, when I had made an opening large enough for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone from it. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how intelligently I crept in. I moved slowly, very, very slowly, so that I wouldn't awaken the old man. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening far enough so that I could see him as he lay on his bed. Would a sick mind have been able to do all of this? And then, when my head was completely inside the room, I lit the lantern carefully, so carefully. I had raised the lamp just at midnight, but in the sneaky light I found the eye was always closed. And so it was impossible to kill him, because it was not the old man whom I hated. It was his evil eye. And every morning, I calmly went into his room and spoke normally to him, calling him by name in a kind voice, and asking how he had slept. So you see, he would have been a very sharp old man to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in on him while he was asleep. On the 8th night, I was more than usually careful in opening the bedroom door. I had my head in and was about to light the lantern when my thumb slipped on the metal latch and the old man jumped up in bed crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night. Finally, I heard a slight groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain, oh no. It was the low, muffled sound that comes from one's very soul when overpowered with fear. Thoughts must have entered his scared mind, such as, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor. Or it is probably a cricket, which has made a single chirp." Yes, he'd been trying to comfort himself with these explanations, but they were useless. All useless because the shadow of death was near him. And it was this unseen shadow that caused him to feel, even though he never saw or heard it, to feel the presence of my head inside the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I decided to open a very, very little crack in the lantern to light a flame in the lamp. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how quietly, until at last a simple, dim ray of light, like the thread of the spider, rose in the lantern and gleamed on the vulture eye. I silently gulped in terror because I could see the old man's deformed eyeball was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I stared at it. I saw it perfectly, all a dull blue with an ugly, gooey cover over it that chilled my very bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or body, for I had directed the lantern's ray as if by instinct exactly on that dreadful spot. I heard a low, dull, quick sound like what a watch makes when covered with cloth. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my anger just as the beating of a drum pushes a soldier into battle. But even then I kept still. I hardly breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried to keep the beam upon the eye. Meanwhile, the hellish beat of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every minute. The old man's terror must have been extreme. His heartbeats grew louder and louder and louder. Can you understand me? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now at that dead hour of the night, with the dreadful silence of the old house being filled with a strange pumping, pounding sound, I got excited and began to feel uncontrollable terror. Yet somehow, for a few minutes longer, I controlled myself and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart would burst. And now a new thought grabbed me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled at my success, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled thud. This didn't bother me much. It would not be heard through the wall. Finally it stopped. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and checked the body. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand on the heart and held it there quite a while. There was no beat. He was definitely departed. Totally gone. Completely dead and out of his misery. His eye would never trouble me again. If you still think I'm a raving lunatic, you won't any longer when I describe the wise precautions I took to hide the body. The night grew on, and I worked quickly, but in silence. First of all, I took the corpse apart, piece by piece. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the room and put everything in the floor. I then replaced the boards so skillfully, so smartly that no human eye, not even his, could have seen anything wrong. When I was finished, it was 4 in the morning, still dark as midnight. As the clock marked the hour, I heard someone knocking at the street door. I went down to open it happily, for what did I now have to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves as police officers. They said that a scream had been heard by a neighbor during the night, that they were notified and sent to search the house. I smiled, for what did I have to worry about? I welcomed the officers in. The scream, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was away in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I gave permission to search. I led them to his room. I showed them the old man's belongings, safe, undisturbed. In the excitement of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and asked the police to sit and rest, while I, happy with my victory, placed my own seat on the very spot above the corpse. My head ached, and I got a ringing in my ears. But the officers still sat and chatted. The ringing became stronger. It continued and became clearer. I talked more to get rid of the feeling, but the strange sound continued and became clearer, until finally I found that the noise was not in my ears. No doubt, I now grew very pale. I talked more, and with a louder voice. Still, the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much like the noise a watch makes when covered with cloth. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers did not hear it. I talked more quickly, but the noise steadily got worse. I stood and argued loudly about anything, but the racket steadily increased. Why would they not leave? I paced the floor back and forth with heavy steps, but the strange sound continued to pierce my ears. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I yelled, I swore, I swung the chair that I was sitting on, I dragged it on the floorboards, but the noise rose above everything and wouldn't stop. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they didn't hear? Almighty God! No! No! They heard! They suspected! They knew! They were making a joke of my horror! This, I thought, and this, I think. But anything was better than this pain. Anything was more tolerable than this cruel joke. I couldn't bear those fake smiles any longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, listen, louder, 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 louder! Stop! I screamed. I can't take it anymore! I admit the deed! Tear up the floors! Here it is! The beating of this rotten heart!